Hi, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the next installment of the Publishing and Finance webinar series, co-sponsored by CSWEP and AFET. And today I am very pleased to welcome Stefan Nagel. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation and for joining us today. And the discussion will be moderated by a set of terrific moderators, Ashley Eldemeyer Poindexter from the University of Tennessee at Knoxville, and Andra Gent from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So over to you, Ashley and Andra. Demystify away.
Great. Thanks so much for joining us. So, Stefan, you are obviously the editor of the Journal of Finance, but you have a lot of insight, I think, into the profession more generally and how to write good papers. And I'm wondering, getting a paper through the editorial process at a good journal is the very last step in the research production process. What advice would you give junior scholars about writing drafts that are kind of ballpark for a journal like the Journal of Finance before they get to the point of submitting?
So if I have to give one piece of advice, I would start with, recognizing that writing matters. For better or worse, I think in the social sciences, the facts and the theorems, they don't speak for themselves. We need to interpret the results we have, and we need to persuade an audience. And for that purpose, the introduction of the paper is really crucial, especially the first few pages. You have to get a referee's attention, an editor's attention, the audience attention on the first few pages, and convince them that you have something important to say in the paper. And if I look at some papers that do this well, and I look at some papers that don't do this so well, one distinction sometimes you can see is that some papers write the paper following the process of discovery that led them to their results, and that's not quite the right way to write a paper. When you write a paper, you want to forget about the whole messy path of how you get to your results, and take a step back and think about what is the most logical, clearest, most transparent way in which I can explain to the audience what I'm doing, why it's important, and why they should be interested in it. I think a helpful way of getting there is taking some papers by some really excellent people in the field and taking a look at them and really trying to deconstruct how do they go about writing the paper, how do they structure the introduction, how do they describe results in the paper. If there are some weaknesses in the analysis, how do they deal with this? How do they argue around that? How do they do this? So this would be my advice.
Great, thank you.
So we all think that our papers are making meaningful contributions to the literature, but do you have any advice for how we can maybe assess when we've got papers that are, strongly leading versus being supportive or kind of extending in a more marginal way? What's your process for kind of sussing out where your paper or a particular project lands like in that spectrum of contribution?
Yeah. So this is a really tough question, of course, because there is inevitably some subjectivity involved, right? I mean, economists disagree about things, and they also disagree about what is a meaningful contribution and what is not. That said, I think you can, see some patterns that make it more or less likely whether a paper really makes a strong contribution, at least in the eyes of many people in the profession. And for this, I would recommend, when you write your introduction and you look at how you describe to the world why your paper should be read, look at what kind of arguments you're making. So sometimes, for example, you can see, let me give some negative examples that, illustrate, what doesn't quite work, right? Sometimes you see papers that say, okay, some people have looked at effect X. Some papers have looked at the effect Y. I'm looking at the interaction of X and Y, full stop, right? Now, you don't want to stop there because it's not obvious to the world why the interaction of X and Y is interesting. You want to make a point, why is the interaction of X and Y really economically interesting? What is the new thing we learn from this? So is there some theoretical mechanism that is interesting that the literature hasn't been able to test yet, that where this really sheds light on? Have people in the past already said somewhere that this interaction is interesting, but people didn't have data to test it? I have the data to do it. So, this was one example. You could think of other instances, but you basically try to assess, do a self-assessment in the way you write about a paper. Am I really making a strong point? That there's an economic contribution here. And what you also need to keep in mind is that a subfield of finance evolves over time. So to pick an example from my own area of research, cross-section of stock return factor models. If you look into the Journal of Finance or some other top finance journal 10, 15 years ago, you still found papers that said, aha, I found an anomaly, or aha, I found a new factor. And that was it, right? And at the time, this was fine because there weren't so many anomalies and factors around. Now the bar has changed a little bit. Right now it would be difficult to publish. I'm not saying impossible, but it would be more difficult than 10, 15 years ago to publish a paper that just says, here's a new anomaly. So you want something in addition to this, right? So when you think about your marginal contribution, also keep in mind where this literature has been going. And that's, the bar in a certain subfield tends to go up a little bit all the time.
Thank you.
Thanks. So you already hit on a couple of what things I was going to ask about in terms of tips for junior scholars and sort of common mistakes in terms of work on the writing. We write for a living, and especially the introduction. But are there any other kind of one or two mistakes that you see consistently that you're like, this would be so easy to fix? I don't know why they sent it to me like this.
No, there's only a few I could mention. Again, it has to do with the writing. Because, in terms of mistakes, easy to fix, sort of a flaw in the basic research question design is hard to fix, right? But writing is really something, errors in writing is what you want to avoid. And so I guess I would mention three things. So one is you want to get to your main point quickly. Don't bore referees with 5 pages of literature discussion before you actually tell them what your paper is really about. Right? So after 2 pages, at least, at most, it should be clear what the main point is of the paper that you're trying to make your main contribution, right? And you can leave some details for later. The second point, something that I often see in papers is that a paper discusses the related literature and then starts by saying our paper contributes to the literature on X. And that's it. Now, as a reader, you're then left with the question, well, okay, so how is being contributed to this literature here? What is new? So it's much better to say, you contribute to this literature and our novel, view on this, our novel take, our contribution, the way we differ. So you want to explain this to the reader, right? That it's clear. And then another point that I also often see is, papers often have certain weaknesses. Let's say, let me pick a concrete example. Let's say there's an identification problem that is hard to address, right? You don't want to wait until page 30 of the paper until you actually finally get to this important endogeneity issue that you so far haven't discussed. Because then it feels like to a referee that you're somehow hiding this away in the back of the paper and hoping that nobody pays attention to this. If there's really a crucial identification issue here, you want to make this front and center of the paper. And it's not necessarily always required that you perfectly address that problem, but you want to be upfront about it and discuss what sort of consequences might follow from that problem and address it head on rather than putting it somewhere in the back of the paper. So in general, if there's a weakness, it's probably better to be transparent about it and address it head on rather than trying to hide it somewhere.
Great.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I guess I could go on, but.
So part of that process of kind of knowing what you need to address or how best to pitch your writing or the work that you're trying to get across is being able to present it widely and with people who are I'm going to be able to give you critical feedback, but it's a little hard sometimes for juniors to get those presentation opportunities, especially at some of the more exclusive conferences or seminar invitations. Do you have any advice for how we can best workshop our papers or kind of get the roadshow going so that when we get to a referee or the submission process, we're likely to maybe not get a desk reject and have someone doing that reading?
Yeah, so I think it is crucial because when this happens to me all the time too. I write a paper and I keep getting amazed at how people perceive my paper, like early drafts of the paper. I'm surprised. I didn't quite anticipate that people read it the way they do. I thought it should be read differently, and I thought I had made things clear. And in seminars, presentations are often ways of finding this out, how people perceive what you're doing, and then you can respond to this and rewrite and rephrase things and so on. So I think getting this feedback is really important. And it is difficult for junior people often to get to these conference presentations and seminar presentations. But I think that the pandemic here brought us in a way an opening, but forcing all of us to go on Zoom and being familiar with it, I think it's much easier now to organize, for example, a small specialized conference or something like this. If you know a number of people that work on similar issues that may have shared interests, why not get all of them together in a Zoom session, make a joint little conference, and get feedback this way. So I think getting the feedback is really important for this.
So following up on that, when you kind of receive papers, do you put a lot of emphasis on, I guess, the roadshow or like the acknowledgements and things for presentations and feedback when you're deciding whether or not to send a paper to a referee?
No, I don't look at this when I make those decisions. And it will also be, I guess sometimes people think it's important that you have somehow shown the paper to an editor in a seminar or so, and so on. But you need to keep in mind that editors look at hundreds of papers every year. And the chances that a paper was actually presented in a seminar that an editor attended is really small. And even if it was presented, I don't think I recall all that many presentations that I have seen in 6 months ago or something like this, just because of the sheer volume of stuff that I have to look at. So I think the feedback aspect is more important here than the advertising aspect.
You've probably got more bandwidth for remembering papers than anyone. One last question about kind of getting in front of a referee. So the process tends to be, in my experience, tends to be a little random. So you get some referees that do such a great job, right? They do a close reading, they really kind of maybe criticize you, but also give you some constructive criticism versus just completely destroying your morale and your paper as well. Is there anything that we can do, while we are either writing our letters to the editor or working on our presentations and framing the paper to kind of help or improve the likelihood that we'll get for lack of a better term, a high quality referee?
Yeah, so I think this again comes back to the writing. There's not all that much you can do, but you can try to avoid some bad outcomes. For example, what you want to avoid definitely is getting mismatched referee, because the editor somehow, from reading the introduction, misunderstood what your paper is about. To give you a concrete example, suppose you have a paper that has some combination of a model and some empirics, but the model is really a sideshow. You use it a little bit, but the main thing is really the empirics. You want to avoid creating the impression that your paper is a theory paper, and then the editor mistakenly assigns a theory referee to it. And so I think that's what you can do, but just with a very careful writing of the paper, make sure that the editor at least understands what the paper is about, and then assigns a properly matched referee to the paper.
Great. How How do you handle situations in which referees are split on whether to accept or reject a paper? In terms of whether you decide to send it to a third referee, or which factors sway you to feel like you want to make a decision right then and there with two reports?
So this is actually, in a way, the main part of my job, what I spend a lot of time on, because we do get a lot of split decisions at the JF. Just to give you a rough idea, if we had a mechanical rule where we said we only give revise and resubmits to papers where we have two referees, and we typically do have two referees. So if you had a mechanical rule that says we need two positive referees for revise and resubmit, we would probably publish 30 papers a year. So there's a lot of split recommendations, and a lot of the revise and resubmits that we give are with split referees, and sometimes even with two negative referees. That's not very common, but that also happens. And so what goes through my head when we make these decisions? The thing I'm trying to think about is whether there's a feasible path forward. So when I have a negative referee and a positive referee, I look at the negative referee's report and I look at what are the points that are being raised here. Are these really fundamental flaws, or is this stuff that's relatively easily fixable? And if it's relatively easily fixable and the paper seems interesting, then why not give the authors a chance to address this? And then sometimes, even if it seems like these are comments that are hard to address, I then also wonder, well, is the topic really interesting, right? Is this potentially a high payoff paper where if the authors do get their act together and manage to address this, would this really be a really interesting paper? And in those cases, then sometimes I might also say, this is worth taking a risk here. Even if I'm not sure whether the authors can address these comments, let's see what they do. So I guess the level of interest from the point of view of the editor in sort of the topic, the novelty, also plays a role there.
So that sounds like you're saying even when you get reports that are maybe not as positive or like deeply reviewing a paper, you're still willing or receptive to put your own, preferences as editor ahead of what the referees are suggesting?
So that's what we're doing at the JF. That's kind of our model, where we have relatively active editors that are trying to not take the bottom line recommendations at face value, but try to look beyond that at the points that are being made. Now, of course, it is also true that as editors, we cannot fully referee all papers ourselves, right? That's why we do have referees and so on. So there are limits to how far you can go with this approach, but we try to play an active role and not just take the bottom line recommendations of the referees at face value.
Great. So, we've all had situations where we feel like there's a set of people or maybe one person that might be hostile to our paper. And it can either be that we think it's a competing paper, or we are directly contradicting something they've said that we suspect they're very invested in for whatever reason, or maybe it's a personal situation. Like, what's the best way of handling that? And should we put in the cover letter? Should we try to strategically not cite them? Should we how do you recommend handling that?
I think the best way is just to put it in the cover letter. So at the JF, we usually say you don't need a cover letter. I think we have this somewhere in the submission guidelines, that you don't need that. Because usually there's no point in just, sometimes authors rehash the contribution of the paper also in the cover letter. There's really no point in it. But if there is a specific reason, like the one you mentioned, that that there's a person or a group of people who are hostile to your work and who you think might not have an objective opinion, then it's totally fine to explain this in the cover letter to the editor. I actually find this useful information. I don't feel like I'm bound to follow it, but we are typically happy to follow these kinds of requests, and I perceive this as useful information. So there's really nothing wrong with putting this in the cover letter.
Excellent. You just saved me lots of time because I'm never writing I'm rarely writing a cover letter to submit to a journal hereafter, now that you told me they don't matter.
Yeah.
Is that the right way of reading that comment?
Yeah.
Excellent.
At least at the JF, I'm not sure, I cannot speak for other editors, but at the JF, you don't just need a cover letter.
Great. So I want to turn a little bit to what you like seeing from referees. So when you get a referee report, what are you most grateful for that somebody put in? When are you just like, oh, thank you so much for doing that? When are you grateful that a referee did a particular thing?
So I think that there are two really big points that are really important and that sort of trump everything else. The first one is I like to get reports where the referee's bottom line recommendation is consistent with what's in the report. What is really difficult for an editor to work with is a cover letter from the referee that says, oh, this paper is really bad because of this and that. And then the report reads like, oh, this is a great paper, very interesting. And there's some minor things, but it's really great. Because then what am I supposed to do with this? With this inconsistency there, right? So having a consistent message between the bottom line recommendation and what's in the report. So if you're recommending a rejection, there has to be a really good reason for it, and it should be there in the report, right? So that's, I guess, the first point. And the second one is that we really appreciate if referees are clear in their reports about points that are really major and important for clearing the bar, and points that would sort of be nice to be addressed, you would maybe make the paper better, but are really not crucial for clearing the bar. This is hugely helpful because when we're giving guidance to authors about how to deal with a revise and resubmit situation, how to go forward, how to revise the paper, we do want to give them guidance, in terms of saying, here's the important stuff you need to address, and here's the stuff that's not so important that is maybe optional. And if a referee already tells me that from their view, what they think is optional and what is not, that helps a lot in doing that.
And would you prefer to see that kind of the must-have versus would be nice in the letter to you, or would you rather see it in the report? How would you like to see it?
I think a report is best. This is very clear. Then we also all know the authors know that this was written in a report, not some sort of side information to the editor. I think the most transparent way is just putting this in the report and being very, having two sections for major comments that are important to be addressed and comments that may be optional.
So if I can sort of summarize it, and I just want to make sure I understand, it sounds like you prefer there be a fair bit of transparency between the information you're getting from the referee and what the author's getting. So it's not sort of, you got a different set of information than what the author got directly.
Sure.
So in that sense, a letter to you separate from the referee report is not as critical. I mean, obviously people will write one, but it shouldn't have a ton of different information. That's
right. There can be some sort of special information that where for example, a referee might explain that for a certain reason they don't feel qualified to express an opinion about a certain aspect of the paper, or things like that. So that's useful for an editor. You should put this into a cover letter. But sort of main issues about the paper, the substance of it, your comments, this should also, I think, all be transparent and laid out in the report rather than just in a cover letter.
Great.
Do you have any advice on how we could best maybe think about the way that the paper is going to be received once it's like hitting your desk, so that we can kind of ensure the likelihood that we'll end up with one of the more, I guess, careful referees? And for our letter to you doesn't matter so much. It's mostly the introduction or the way that our paper is first coming across. And our end of thinking, should we be pushing more, theoretical contributions, empirical contributions? Like, what's the process that you kind of go through when you're kind of checking off whether or not a paper is worthy of your better referee's time?
So I think the important thing is to highlight what you think is the strongest point of your paper, right? So if there's some theory in there or some empirics, it depends on what you want to highlight. You want to highlight the area in the paper that has the most novelty, and communicate this very clearly in the introduction, also in the early parts of the introduction, what sort of the key thing is about the paper. And this goes back to what I said earlier about, finding the proper match. As an author, you can't do much to control whether an editor assigns a careful or not so careful referee. I mean, as editors, we like to assign careful referees. It doesn't always work, but we tried. No editor likes referees that write sloppy reports because it's kind of an embarrassment to send these reports on to authors. But the world is not perfect. So there's, from the author's viewpoint, not that much you can do. But what you can try to really manage is the matching, that you get a good match in terms of expertise of the referee.
So we have a follow-up question very related to this in terms of incentivizing high quality reports. Sometimes it feels like there's not an incentive, especially as people get busy. And it often sometimes feels like the reviewer's incentive is just to try to get the paper off their desk as quickly as possible, rather than really giving each paper a decent chance at publication. And I think especially for people who are junior or sort of at less research intensive universities, it sometimes can feel like nobody wanted to give their paper a chance. And how do you kind of incentivize referees to give every paper a chance, given that it's an anonymous service, you're the only person that kind of sees the quality of the report? Like, how do we incentivize good refereeing?
Yeah, so I think, unfortunately, this is a question where our profession has not found great answers to, and I include myself there. I wish we had a way of better rewarding really good referees. There's only a very few imperfect ways of doing this. So some journals give prizes for good refereeing, but again, this is just a very small number of individuals every year. So how big is the incentive effect there? I'm not sure. Some recognition does come in the long term. If people do a really good job of refereeing, the quality of refereeing is a main consideration when we, for example, look for associate editors, right? We look back at their track records, how did they do for the GF, timeliness, quality of reports. And if you do become an associate editor, this does give you some visibility, and many home institutions also like having the faculty members being associate editors at jobs. So there's, in the long run, there is some recognition, but in the shorter run, there's unfortunately not that much we have found yet to provide strong incentives. What we do try to do is, for example, to share. We typically always share the decision letters with the referees. And in the decision letter, I do sometimes comment on a referee report. So if I found that a referee made a wrong claim or really wasn't careful or something, this does sometimes show up in my decision letter to the authors. And by sharing this decision letter with the referees, at least I communicate this also to the referee that this was not such a great job. Now, the extent to which the referees care about my opinion there, maybe the effects there are also limited, but that's at least one thing we're trying to do. But I think this is a big unresolved issue in our profession about how to go about this, and we haven't found great solutions to this yet. So it's on our minds, but unfortunately, it's a difficult issue.
So an audience question that's coming through in our chat and in the question and answer room is if you've ever considered altering the policy on anonymous associate editors.
So we're constantly thinking about our policies. So we have thought about this, but we felt like there is, there's a trade-off, there are costs and benefits. If the associate editors are not anonymous, you would start to worry about associate editors now being, not anonymous, maybe catering more to highly influential people in our profession because they are afraid that, they would come back at them with, some feedback later on, and so, there's no perfect solution. And our point, our view at this point is that the trade-off is such that it's better to keep them anonymous. But again, there's a trade-off. We clearly recognize that.
So switching gears just a little bit, I do have a couple of questions about any advice you have for topics that are not, I guess, technically mainstream or in vogue. I mean, we've got a little bit of questions in our chat coming through related to this as well.
Yeah, so this is an interesting question, and as editors, we are also aware of the fact that there are historical examples where some important papers, or papers that eventually proved to be very important, were rejected at various journals before they finally made it. And as an editor, that's not the kind of outcome you want to be responsible for. But that said, it is sometimes not obvious to referees and editors why a not mainstream topic is important. And so you should keep this in mind when you write the paper, that expect skepticism if it's not kind of mainstream, and try to do a particularly good job in telling the audience why this is an important paper. Something that I also mentioned earlier, I think would also be useful here, which is, and this doesn't help for an individual paper, but sort of more as a long-term strategy. If you are working on a kind of new emerging topic, for example, I think it's useful to network with people that have similar interests. You're usually not completely alone. There will be someone else out there that is working on a kind of related issue, even if it's only a small group of people. And then try to get them together, organize a little conference, make sure you send each other's your papers, get feedback, and in this way build some momentum for that area in the research. And then, you can help publicize the conference that you organize a bit. This will help get more recognition that this topic, seems to be getting some attention. You will have a forum to get some feedback on how to deal with these, people's experiences of how to deal with these obstacles that they're facing in pushing a topic.
So we can send cold emails to folks with our papers and kind of saying we're in the same interest, and you can tell us stuff until.
Yeah, I mean, there's no guarantee that you'll get a reply, but if it's especially if it's people that are at a similar stage of the career, for example, other junior faculty, I mean, they're typically happy to exchange feedback and so on papers. So I think that's a good approach. And then again, with Zoom now, it should be quite easy to get something like this off the ground.
Could you speak to maybe your view on kind of upcoming or topics that are starting to maybe take off or have some momentum left for people to contribute to?
Okay, so I think this is a question where I prefer not to make a statement, because I don't think it's our job as editors to tell people what they should be working on. There's thousands of people in our profession, and they all have clever ideas and creativity. And it would kind of be ludicrous to think that a small number of editors can somehow, tell the field where to go, right? So we view our role more as trying to figure out from what we receive what sort of the promising directions are, rather than to tell people where they should be going.
Thanks. So we have a question from the audience about what ratio of R&R papers will finally be published. And I want to modify the question slightly to give the authors some agency here in terms of what the percentage changes. So I guess if you get an R&R, what are like common mistakes you see people make that they really could have gotten it through and they just didn't do it? Like what is the best way to make sure that R&R goes, or the best way of increasing your probability that that revision request goes through? And what are the things that like that was just a stupid thing to do if you have a revision request?
Yeah. So in this, I'm in a way actually in sort of two minds, because on the one hand, if just the question is, what is the best way of making sure you're converting that R&R into an acceptance? Then the advice is clearly whatever you can do to satisfy the referees and the editors and to provide good responses to their comments, even if it involves a lot of work. Whatever you can do, it's going to help convert this into an acceptance. So try to be as careful as you can, and also careful in your explanations that you provide to referees in response to their comments. Be very careful and try to address those comments in detail. Now, the reason why I said I'm in two minds about this is I do feel like in our profession we are spending too much effort in revising papers. So this is certainly on our minds all the time, and you're trying to push back at this a bit by giving guidance to authors, sometimes saying, here are the important points, these things are not so important. But again, if you want to maximize your chances that it goes through, then you want to address comments as well as you can.
Closely related question. So suppose a referee makes a comment or request for revision that's like pretty unreasonable or unnecessary. Will you signal your opinions on the comment request in the decision letter to give the authors some guidance about how to deal with it? And related to this question, if you have referees that are split on what should be done with the paper, how do you manage that?
Yeah, so I try to do that because, again, this issue that we spend too much effort on revising papers in our profession is on my mind. But it's of course also true that whatever I do there is going to be imperfect, right? I cannot referee all papers myself. I'm also sometimes maybe running the risk that I might actually misunderstand the referee. So I think, based on my reading, that is common is actually not so important. And when the revision comes back to the referee and the referee comes back to me, then the referee gives additional explanations telling me why this is really a crucial point, right? And so I have to be mindful of these things as well. But I do try to the best of my ability to give some guidance to authors, and sometimes also tell them explicitly, here's something that you don't need to address, or it's optional, you don't have to.
So I have a question about expansion plans, if there are any for the JF. Are there any plans to increase the number of annual issues?
Mm-hmm. So right now we still have some room to publish more articles per issue. And I also expect that this will happen pretty soon because we have a very full pipeline right now of accepted but not yet published papers. But that's what we will use up first. So we have some scope to further increase the number of papers per year through that channel. And then, if there's more, then we would increase the number of issues. We'll have to see the next years how this develops.
Related, we only have a few more minutes, but what are your biggest concerns about the profession more generally, even aside from the Journal of Finance, and what do you think we should be doing about them?
So I can tell you one of my biggest concerns right now. I don't have a great answer of what to do, but the effect of the COVID pandemic is very much on my mind. I see this every day basically at the journal, that some authors are very prolific in submitting lots of papers during the past year or so. Some people are clearly struggling. I hear it from them when I ask them to referee papers, and they tell me, look, I just cannot right now. And by the way, this is totally fine, right? If someone is struggling right now, it's much better to tell an author, to tell an editor, look, right now I cannot referee, rather than to accept a request and then later not be able to do it. But anyway, so I'm seeing on a day-to-day basis, in a way, the unequal effect that the pandemic has in our profession on some individuals versus others. And it will be a challenge how to deal with this going forward when it comes to tenure and promotion decisions and other issues. And so I think that's a big issue we'll have to deal with the next years. And as I said, I don't have a great 2-line recommendation what to do about this, but this is very much in my mind.
I think we have time for maybe kind of one more question, and I'm going to take it from the chat. So somebody is asking for some with some experience. Laura Grigolon is asking for people with experience publishing papers in econ journals versus finance journals. What differences or peculiarities do you think characterize the publication process in finance relative to econ? So if you've come from an econ background and somehow you made it into a finance department, or you are now working on finance related topic, what's the best tips you could provide for that set of authors?
Yeah, so I mean, broadly speaking, I think there are a lot of similarities. So if you compare, let's say the top 5 econ journals and the top 3 finance journals, there are some differences though. So we do use fewer referees. The turnaround times, are typically faster. The nature of the referee comments is maybe also a little bit different. I think in econ sometimes you get sometimes shorter reports where you do have more referees, but sometimes shorter reports where the referees are not asking for so many detailed things. I haven't done serious analysis of this. This is more kind of based on personal experience. While I think finance referees tend to sometimes ask for more detailed sort of points in their reports, but there's a lot of similarity, I think.
Was that the last question, Ashley and Andra? Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us today, Stefan, and for giving us such thoughtful advice about how to make meaningful and interesting contributions to the literature, for sharing details about the refereeing process, and also some terrific advice about how we can network to get feedback on our papers, so that the most polished product, especially the introduction, it's making its way to your desk. So thank you again very much for joining us. And Ashley and Andra, you did an amazing job moderating this discussion, asking some very important questions, which I think that our audience has found to be very useful. So before I say goodbye, I'd like to mention that our third and final chat in the Publishing and Finance series will be with Itai Goldstein, who is the executive editor of the Review of Financial Studies. And that will be on May 26th at 12 noon Eastern. So please sign up for that if you haven't already. And we will make a video of this really great interview available on the CSWEP and Affect websites. So thank you again for joining us. Have a great afternoon, and see you next time. Bye.
Bye. Thank you very much for organizing.